So, just out of curiosity, who's going through some sort of agile transformation right now? Okay, anybody bigger than 5,000 people? Okay, cool. Anybody like in the, I don't know, couple thousand to 5,000, like mid-size kind of thing? Anybody less than 1,000? Probably everybody else? Okay, I don't think everybody rose their hand, but that's okay. So what I'm going to do, let's see, are we ready to go yet? Yeah. Are you good, Ben? Excellent. So what I'm going to do for the next hour and 40 minutes is try to make a case to you guys for a different way of thinking about approaching an agile transformation. Okay? And just a little bit, make sure my slide changes. Yeah, just a little bit about my background, just so you can understand. I can go a little bit deeper into this since we have so much time. But I grew up mostly in project and portfolio management. Degree in computer science, worked in data centers for the first 10 years of my career, and then moved into IT project management, moved into B2B, e-commerce, B2C, and ended up working for a company called CheckFree right before the Fiserv acquisition. If there's any financial services people out in the room, you guys probably recognize some of those names. And what was interesting, so this was for me back in 2003 to 2005. I went to my first Agile conference in 2006. And think about the state of the literature. Anybody reading Agile literature back in 2005, 2006? Besides Dave Nicolette? Yeah, and so if you guys remember back in the day, we didn't have scaled Agile framework, we didn't have large-scale Scrum, people weren't writing about Agile at scale. What people were doing was they were writing about Agile at the team level. And during that time, we had some really complex problems to solve. And so, the financial services industry, big mainframe on the back end kind of stuff. We had, .NET and Java applications. We were basically building products of products or systems of systems. And we ended up inventing a lot of methodology that probably ended up looking a lot like what SAFe is now. But we were doing really solid team level stuff, really focusing on stabilizing velocity. We were governing team level stuff with basically lean value stream based Kanban queues, basically leveraging David Anderson's pre-Kanban work on agile management, leveraging theory of constraints to figure out how to get the work to flow across organizations, kind of using similar principles at a portfolio level to make sure that we were balancing capacity and demand. And it was, looking back on it, for me, I felt it was really advanced stuff. And what was fascinating, though, for me was the interplay between organizational structure, governance, process, and really how work intake happened, right? It was all part of this one integrated system. And then I had a really cool opportunity. I left that company and to go work for Version 1. And so I worked for Version 1. This is almost 8 years ago now. Worked for them for about 2 years. And what was interesting about that time in my career is that I was able to go out into somewhere over 100, 150 different companies and look at these companies that were trying to adopt Agile. And the thing that I was seeing over and over and over was that the companies that were trying to adopt Agile were really struggling to figure out how to form teams. And they were having a hard time getting capacity and demand into balance, figure out how the flow of work across teams went. And there weren't a whole lot of answers. And so what we did a lot of during that time was trying to figure out how to customize Version 1 in order to be able to accommodate the things that were broken in the organization. And so I had this kind of idea that what I wanted to do is I wanted to be able to change the organization to be able to take better advantage of Agile methodologies. Okay, and so I've had my company Leading Agile for about 8 years, and we've been really fortunate. I started off as an independent consultant. We've got about 75 people. We're based in Atlanta, Georgia, and been very fortunate over those 8 years that we've gotten to work with some of the largest of the large companies in the world. And we've been developing a point of view on how to orchestrate large-scale agile transformation. Okay, and so that's what this talk is fundamentally about, and that's what the payoff of the talk is going to be, is how do you actually manage, track, and plan an agile transformation? Does anybody believe that an agile transformation can actually be planned? Anybody? Does anybody believe that you just train people on agile and it just kind of all just magically happens? Okay, you guys are not good at raising your hands today. This is way not fun if you guys aren't answering me, so. But it's okay, we'll roll with it. So that's what we're really talking about. It's like, I want you guys to leave here with a new way of thinking about Agile transformation, a new way of measuring your success, and some new mental metaphors to think about as far as what is it going to take to actually do this. So, can anybody tell me why their company is transforming?
Because everybody else is.
Oh, it's funny that you say that, because that's actually like probably 50% of the answers, right? So think about it. As practitioners, we're going and saying, give us these consulting dollars, send us to training, do all this stuff. Now, there's some legit reason behind that, because it's like you can't attract developers if you say, hey, you're going to do waterfall, mainframe, COBOL stuff like that, right? So everybody wants to work on hot, latest stuff. Everybody wants to be agile. I get it. But that's like I think it's a weak reason, right, to do it, right? Anybody else?
Because what we're doing right now isn't working.
Because what you're doing right now is working. Can you quantify how it's not working? Like what results are you not getting that you might want?
Missing our moved up timing.
Okay.
Like
Missing dates? Okay. Excellent. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Missing functionality, features that we thought were going to be in.
Missing scope? Okay. Anybody over here?
To reduce cost.
To reduce costs? Okay. Anybody else?
Just want to go to market quicker with better products and better services for clients.
Fascinating. Okay, excellent. Okay, so interesting. Nobody mentioned like responding to change, innovation, right? Being adaptable, right? Figuring out, are we building the right product for market? And that was kind of my realization too. So back in 2008, 2012, again, I have been for a long time an avid reader of books and an avid reader of blogs and kind of a student of our industry. And I think a lot of times we get very enamored with the ability to respond to change, the ability to inspect and adapt, right? Think about the language of Scrum even, right? It's all about inspecting and adapting. And more often than not, what we find is that people are actually want to use Agile because waterfall is not predictable for them, right? They're not making their time, cost, and scope commitments, okay? The next one, I can't remember what order they pop up, is quality, okay? Can we put defect-free code into market? Right? Early return on investment. Can we deliver things in market and start charging money for them? Cost savings. So it's fascinating. So if you go back and you become a student of the early Agile literature, it was more about responding to change and innovation and making sure we're building great products and getting feedback from our customers and all those kinds of things. But for the most part, people are adopting Agile, especially in large companies, because they view it as a potential alternative for achieving what are some very traditional goals of project management, right? And so just as a note, right, there are innovation and product fit, right? So those are benefits of doing Agile. But the thing that I want to drive home in this is that when you're adopting Agile, if you're going to get past the idea of we're just doing it because everybody else does it, if we're going to adopt Agile, it's very important to understand what the goals of the transformation are. You might imagine that if you're focusing on building the right product, that's a different implementation of Agile necessarily than becoming predictable. Okay? Innovation and being able to deliver things earlier or at a lower cost, you might be able to get them both, right? But you need to understand what your measures of success are. And what I'm going to suggest as we build this argument is that the measures of success, what it's going to look like to be successful with your transformation, is going to be largely determined by the goals of the transformation, right? They're kind of inextricably connected. Anybody disagree with that so far? So understand what's important to your business stakeholders, understand why they're going down this path, and what they want to get out of it, okay? Because what we might want out of it might actually be incongruent with what the leadership team wants out of it. The things that we feel are important might be different than what our leaders feel are important, and that creates tension in organizations. So the first thing we want to do is make sure we're really aligned on what the goals of the transformation are. The next point that I want to talk about is what is it that we are transforming? So anybody want to share with me what they think the secret to transformation is? What are like the biggest barriers to doing an Agile transformation? Anybody? Yeah.
Leadership buy-in.
Leadership buy-in, okay. People, okay. Culture. Yep, culture is the one we hear a lot, right? How does somebody go about changing culture? 6,000 people, right? Going through a transformation, focused on culture change. Like, what do you do? Like tomorrow. You're gonna show up, you're in charge, you gotta lead a transformation, you gotta guarantee business results, predictability, quality, and we gotta change culture, right? To me, that feels really, really soft. It's really tough, right? Culture is hard to change. And so the three things that I think are at play in a transformation are, culture's one of them, okay? The practices, processes, and things like that you use is another part of it. But then the third leg, which I think is often under-discussed in our community, is kind of the structure and alignment issues within the organization, right? How teams are formed at scale, how governance works, what you measure, what you control. And the interesting thing is, if you don't figure out how to address all three of these things, it often doesn't work. I would also suggest that if you focus on less than all three of these things, you're making some pretty big bets that might not necessarily be likely to yield the business benefit that you thought, right? And so I've kind of like started talking off these slides a little bit, so I probably need to update them a bit. But the idea is if you decide that you want to do a culture-first transformation, that's a very intoxicating idea, because it's like when we're out there trying to get people to do things differently, right? What we get is resistance and fear and, an unwillingness to try new things and all that kind of stuff. And what I would suggest, though, is that again, like I said, attacking that is hard. But also, if you go down the path of trying to attack that, what you're kind of making a bet. You have a hypothesis. And that hypothesis is that if I can change the culture, the other things in the organization will get fixed. If I could just get people to try a daily stand-up meeting, if I could just get people to do a review and retrospective, if I could just get people to form teams, right? If they had an attitude of experimentation, right, an openness, right, a willingness to work together, then all this stuff would necessarily emerge. For you guys that are like bigger than 5,000, I bet you you've got some mainframe systems going on in the back somewhere. Right? You've got dependencies all over the organization. You probably have matrix teams. You probably have heavy governance. One of the things I think is interesting about the CSM certification, and we've got a great CST on our staff, it's not typically core to how we orchestrate transformation, is that the CSM for me is a lot about getting you in the right mindset to do Agile. Has anybody gone for a CSM certification and come back into their organization and they're like, man, I can't do any of this stuff? Right? And it's just frustrating, and it makes you sad, and it makes you despondent. Or you start to do Scrum and these impediments emerge that are beyond your control. Anybody ever changed the processes of Scrum to accommodate an organizational impediment you couldn't remove? Right? Happens all the time. Okay? And so the challenge becomes is if the ecosystem that you're operating in isn't congruent with the cultural messages that you're trying to instill, what you're going to do is you're going to create a lot of cynicism in the organization. Okay? So we have to make sure that the kinds of impediments that these teams are going to need to overcome are within their control to actually be able to overcome. Okay? And so your bet, though, is that if I focus on culture, all the other systems and practices and things like that will begin to emerge and people will be open to them. I would suggest that's often a bad bet. Okay? The next thing is, right, so if I'm going to be practices focused, right, we're going to do Scrum or we're going to do SAFe, right? A lot of the SAFe training that's out there right now is really focused on how do you orchestrate SAFe. Does anybody feel like they're doing great SAFe or great Scrum, but they're not feeling super agile? Is that possible? Right? Is it possible to go through the motions of Scrum or to go through the motions of SAFe and not actually get predictable? Or not actually be able to put things into market? Right? Why do we think that is? Right? Because the practices associated with it don't necessarily yield the business benefit if you can't get through release management in a timely manner. Or you have to have 3 months of regression testing. Or if you've got multiple release trains across a whole organization that have dependencies between them. Right? So there's a lot of organizations that are doing perfect SAFe and perfect Scrum that are not achieving agility. So if you teach people to do those methodologies, which is fine, right? I'm a supporter of all of them. If you teach people to do those methodologies and they can't influence the ecosystem that they're operating in, then what happens is you end up with a lot of people that are going through the motions. The bet that you've made, anybody ever heard the expression, Scrum doesn't solve your problems, it just shows you your impediments? Right? And then it'll be up to you to fix them. Well, if the impediments that you hit are refactoring the legacy mainframe into a services-oriented architecture, right? Often that's beyond your span of control to actually go out and change. Okay? And so your bet, though, if I teach you Scrum, Scrum will show you impediments, and then you'll fix them. That bet often doesn't pay off in organizations. So the third thing that I like to think about is this idea of systems, right? Or team formation strategies, or how you govern, how the pieces of the organization interact. And what I would suggest is that every single methodology out there was designed for a particular context. Right? It made some underlying assumptions about the kind of environment you are in. If you think about Scrum, Scrum assumes that you've got 6 to 8 people that are basically working on a team where the entire value stream is encapsulated with a single team. The product owner gets to decide, and the team can release something into production every sprint. Right? Kinda, right? For it to really work, it has to work like that. Anybody actually have that kind of ecosystem in their company? Right? That's why, right? I can't tell now whether you guys don't have it or whether nobody will raise their hand here. So it's like, so we're just going to pretend that nobody has it for right now, because it actually serves my purpose if that's the case too. So, and then the other thing was SAFe too, right? It's the same deal, right? So what SAFe did is SAFe came along and recognized that the value stream can't be encapsulated within a single team. So it put a planning construct around a larger thing called a value stream. Release trains, things like that. Well, the challenge there is if you've got dependencies within that group, right, those dependencies are often unmanaged. Okay? And so what we have to do is we have to test the hypothesis. We have to test the assertion we're making and understand if the kinds of changes we make we actually think are going to yield the business benefits that we want. And so kind of my assertion is if we want to do SAFe, we have to understand what are the organizational constructs that make SAFe work, and we have to, I use a heavy word, but install those first, and then enable that with practices. And then when we have the ecosystem and we have the practices, right, now we have an underlying kind of substrate within the organization that we can start asking people to change their minds and their beliefs. Is that fair? You guys see what I'm saying? Anybody like vehemently disagree at this point, this early? Right, yeah, so it's like it's congruence, right? It's really about alignment. And again, like I do this one talk sometimes, and a lot of times I'll do this for user groups in like small informal environments. And I'll say, if you were king for a day, and maybe not for a day, maybe you're just king, right? You've been named king, right? You're totally in charge. You have all the money, you have everything you need, you can flip culture overnight. You can install whatever practices you want, right? The only challenge is that within 3 months you have to have tangible, measurable success within the organization. Like, what are you going to show up and do tomorrow, right? Like, let's take the boogeyman out, right? Take the leadership support, take the money out, take the culture change out, right? Everybody's got the right attitude. What would you go do? And what I find is that most people don't really have a clean answer for that. What would I go do tomorrow if I had to guarantee success? Right? It's an interesting question, right? So we're going to try to answer that a little bit. Okay, so again, right, all three are important, but I think where you start is absolutely essential. Okay, so the other thing that I want to kind of introduce before we start getting into much of the meat and potatoes of this is that different organizations have different constraints, different things that need to be overcome. Has anybody ever had an experience where they introduced Agile into an organization? It was really clean, really simple, just kind of worked out of the gate, and then went someplace else and it didn't work? Right? Yeah. Well, because different organizations are different, right? Different organizations have different natural alignments, different governances, different ways they operate, different teams, different people, right? Different all kinds of things. And so the first thing that I like to think about is that the scale of the organization is going to dramatically impact the kinds of things that you do to lead the transformation. If you are literally a Scrum Master on top of a 6 or 7 person team, send them all to Scrum Master training and just work with them. Right? If they're a development team, teach them tech practices, right? All that kind of stuff. Really straightforward, pick up a book, go to some classes, and you're gonna be fine. What we find is if you start to get into like 6, 8, 10 person teams, maybe sending that group and doing some SAFe is probably the right thing. I know there's probably some Ford people in the room, right? There's some Quicken Loans people in the room. I'm trying to think of some Cottmeyer's here in town going through a transformation. What you see at those levels of scale requires different things. It requires different change management. It requires different patterns. Sometimes you have to put compensating controls on top of SAFe or on top of Scrum to manage some of the dependencies and such before you get started. Okay? And so what I want you guys to recognize out of this little piece of segment is that the size and scale and complexity of the transformation is going to largely shape how you approach it. So the things that you could probably get away with in a small team environment, send some people to training, hire a Scrum Master, are not going to be the kinds of things that it's going to take to shift the connected vehicle platform at Ford, right? It's just different, right? It's a different caliber of problem. Is it warm in here to you guys? I'm gonna have to like drop this jacket here in a second, so God, I'm gonna start breaking a sweat. Okay, so size of the organization is going to matter to your transformation strategy. This is probably the most important slide in the deck. And these are just 8 different classes of the dependencies that I rattled off at the top of my head when I built this slide years ago now. But I will go on record and say dependencies kill Agile. Right? Dependencies are going to get in your way. And I have this story that I like to tell. I actually asked my wife for her permission to tell it. She kind of looked at me funny and said, "Are you sure?" But I said, "Yeah, I think it's funny." So, the idea is like if I want to go to dinner, okay, and I change my mind, and I'm not going with anybody else, I don't have to coordinate with anybody to go to dinner, right? I can go, want to go for pizza, want to go for steak, want to grab a beer, right? Do whatever I want. If my wife and I are going to dinner, like my wife doesn't particularly care for Italian food, and I always want to go to Mexican, so she almost never wants to go to Mexican. But regardless, right, if we're going to go to dinner together and I change my mind, I have to coordinate with her, right? Right? It's fair, right? So that's like a dependency. So I can't do anything that I want. I can't change on a dime if I have dependencies with other pieces of the organization. Okay? This is probably one of the most extreme examples of this, and it's probably not the most extreme, but it's the most referenceable extreme one, is we were working for a bank that had like 6 Scrum teams kind of operating in a quasi-SAFe kind of mode, and those teams were relatively independent, well-structured. They had 46 external dependencies in order to get anything into production. Can you imagine how fast they were able to release? Right? Probably not super fast. Okay? Were they doing great Scrum? Absolutely. Were they doing great SAFe? Absolutely. Could they release anything into production? No. Were they predictable? No. Were they able to reduce costs? No. Were they able to get things in market fast? No. But they were doing great SAFe. And the reason why they couldn't do it well, is because of all the dependencies they had in the rest of the organization. So dependencies are your number one impediment to achieving the goals of agility. Has nothing to do with whether you can do SAFe or not, or whether you can do Scrum. But dependencies limit your agility. And then the thing I had to ask for permission for is that my in-laws, God love them, they're pushing 80 at this point. They eat at 4:30 in the afternoon, and they only eat steak, right? So if we want to go to dinner with them, we are going at 4:30 in the afternoon, and it eats steak. You can't change the date on them at the last minute. So like my in-laws become like a really, really hard dependency, And that's a dependency that can't be broken, so it reduces our agility, right? That always sounds funnier in my head, but I just think it's fun to pick on my in-laws. But it's like the same thing, right? If you are a mobile team and you can deliver all the time, and you have a 40-year legacy mainframe COBOL ACH transaction processing engine on the backside, right? That's going to limit your ability to be agile, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so dependencies and the strength of dependencies, the nature of dependencies, the difficulty of breaking dependencies are going to shape the things that you do. So getting back, right, if we're going to do Scrum in that kind of environment, we're going to make the assumption that Scrum's going to show us those dependencies, and we're going to break them. Can't always break them that easy, right? And so if we're going to do safe, we're going to assume that our dependencies are encapsulated within our value stream. If they're not, then we have to do something besides safe, because safe doesn't deal with cross value stream dependencies very well. Okay? And then on top of that, whatever mechanism we choose to manage cross value stream dependencies has to make us more predictable, has to help us deliver earlier, has to help us lower costs, right? All those kinds of things, right? So it just starts to become this interesting conundrum of a problem, right? But if our job is to actually fix it and to get the business benefit from Agile that we want, that's what our job is, right? So the third thing is, oh yeah, go ahead.
On your last slide, we couldn't
Yeah.
see the bottom dependencies.
Yeah, I apologize. So sometimes this is actually unreadable depending upon the lighting in the room, so I'm actually happy that you can see it. Matrix organizations, what do I have up there? Low cohesion, tight coupling. I'll look here, forget what I put on there. Technical debt and defects. Yeah, right? And so what I was doing is I was just kind of rambling off the top of my head the things that come up all the time that are getting in the way of us being able to do Agile. The low cohesion tight coupling thing is like, is like a huge, huge problem, right? In creating technical inter-team dependencies. Okay, one time I was at a CIO event in Atlanta a couple years ago, and I put this slide up, and the CIO raises his hand, he goes, but yeah, that's like all the stuff in my organization. And I said, cool, that's your job to overcome it. Right, it's your job to put a plan in place to overcome it. Right? Work with your teams, of course, right? But just because this stuff exists, right? So we as practitioners, we have two choices. We either say, you know what, this stuff exists, it's beyond our control. So we're going to kind of do the best we can with the tools that are handed to us, and we're just going to limp along, or we're going to make the case that this stuff can be removed. Okay, and we're going to create an economically justifiable plan to do it. Like I'm a real big believer in like don't do things that you know aren't going to work, and I'm also not a real big believer in impossible problems. It's like you get like this is like a small example, but somebody will say to me, "Well, how do I do Scrum when I've got 46 external dependencies and I don't have a product owner that's authoritatively able to give me my backlog?" And I go, "You don't. Right? You don't. Right? You can do daily stand-ups. That might help." Right? You can do reviews and retrospectives, you can do sprint planning, but you're not going to be able to deliver working tested software every sprint. Right? You're just not going to, right? So you have two choices. It's just really simple. You either break the dependencies and you create the conditions to do Scrum, or you leave them in place but don't expect to get the business benefit from Scrum. Right? Those are really your only two choices in my opinion. Okay? So the third thing which I think is interesting is resistance. And, we're kind of going through an interesting phase right now where there's a lot of C-level attention to Agile. There's a lot of funding out there for Agile. And the interesting thing, though, is that we'll go into places and we'll say, well, what are the resistors going to look like? People say there's no resistance whatsoever. Our CEO is totally bought into doing Agile. And I go, well, yeah, right, but does anybody have a middle manager that's kind of maybe at a director or VP level that's been kind of in their job for 20, 25 years? Right? Think about what it is, right? We could say this is culture, but think about why does that person resist change? Right? They might be, mid-career, 45, 50 years old, probably have kids in college, probably have a mortgage, right? Probably have a really nice organization underneath them. They've worked super hard. They've climbed the ladder, right? They have a really nice life, really nice job. And then somebody comes along and says, that stuff that's made you successful for 25 years isn't working anymore, right? You have to do something totally different, right? That doesn't create a lot of safety for anyone, does it? Right? And it's not that I'm not open, I'm not responding to change. It's not like I wouldn't want to try something. But you've got to give me some indication that this is going to be successful. Did you have a question? No. Oh, okay. Some indication that this is going to be successful. We have to put some guardrails on this. We have to run some experiments. We have to try some things. Right? It's just because I don't want to upheave my entire life doesn't mean I'm resistant to change. It's like I want you to explain to me how these changes are actually going to create the business value that you promise. I think we've got a little bit of a problem in our industry. I wrote a post a couple years ago. It's called, what is that parable, Emperor's New Clothes? Right, where the guy's wearing like nothing. and like nobody wants to say anything because it's like you're going to be looked down on. It's like you have to prove your hypotheses. You have to be able to say, we're going to do this, and this is the path to get the outcome. And I think that's fair, right? And what we found is that if you can articulate those kinds of strategies very clearly, you can get people to try things. Okay? So where have we been so far, right? So we talked about the need to have business value, right? The need to identify the business value. We talked about the need to address culture, practices, and systems. And now we've talked about the things that are going to get in the way. Okay? All three of those classes of things are going to shape what your methodology looks like, and it's going to shape what your transformation strategy is going to be like to get there. Can we all agree that Agile is not a one-size-fits-all thing, and your transformation plan is not a one-size-fits-all strategy? Right? Okay, cool. Have I debunked the myth that you guys can go train a bunch of people and have it all magically work? Okay, hope so, right? Okay, cool. Anybody? No? Questions? We good? We have so much time, right? I feel like we could just chit-chat all afternoon. Okay, cool. So we're going to pivot just a little bit. And what I want to talk about is, for me, what I believe to be the non-negotiable core of every Agile methodology. Okay? With probably the exception of Lean or Kanban, but it will absolutely help in those cases as well. But anything that's like Scrum-based or XP-based, right? Scrum, XP, SAFe, LESS, Disciplined Agile Delivery, right? All that kind of stuff. The non-negotiable core are these things I call the three things. And it's teams, it's backlogs, and it's working tested software. And so I'm going to be hyper explicit about what I mean by teams, backlogs, working tested software. A lot of times I'll say, who here forms teams? Let's do a experiment. Who has teams? Right? Everybody? Okay, cool. So let's talk about what a team looks like in Agile. A team in Agile is typically a group of people, typically 6 to 8. We could have a side conversation about our keynote this morning if you guys wanted to, because we could absolutely accommodate that, but it's beyond the scope of what I want to talk about. The idea is that about 6 to 8 people that largely stay together, that have everything and everyone necessary to deliver whatever it is in their backlog, right, and can make those decisions relatively autonomously. That kind of implies that they have some ownership over the technical stack, that they can actually deploy, they can actually put something in front of a customer, and they can get feedback on it, right? Now, who has those kinds of teams? Right? So that's a problem. Good for you. Awesome, right? It happens, right? It happens in pockets, but it doesn't happen universally enough. The first time I ever went into a talk, and I did this, I had a whole talk around it called The Three Things. It was at a Scrum gathering in Vegas, and 500 Scrum practitioners in the room, and I asked that question, and like nobody raised their hand. And you think about it, right? That's a fascinating thing, right? Scrum is totally predicated on the idea that you have a complete cross-functional team. Okay? Because that is what's going to take to be able to stabilize velocity, right? To start to anticipate your throughput through the team. And so what you find is that organizations that can't form teams that stay together with minimal dependencies between them are not going to have stable velocity. What does stable velocity mean? It means that we know the rate of completion of the backlog. That means we're predictable, right? Getting to a definition of done at the end of the sprint is going to enable us to ship early. Right? It's going to help us with quality because we know that we're to that definition of done, right? All those things, right? All of the goals of the system that we discussed break down in the absence of complete cross-functional teams with minimal dependencies between them. Okay? So teams are a really big deal. Backlogs. That's another thing. I think this is probably as much, if not a bigger problem than the teams problem. Because a backlog in Scrum is a very specific construct. It's not just a nebulous list of wishes and thematic elements that the product owner would like us to build, right? It's a list of user stories that are broken down into increments that the team can build in a day or 2 or 3 or something like that. Handful of them within a sprint. They meet Bill Wake's and VEST criteria: independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, small, and testable. Right? They're discrete. They're like a scenario under a use case, maybe even. Okay? So a user story, right? A backlog made up of user stories is a very specific construct. And when you go into organizations, you'll get the questions like, well, do you have a product owner? No. Well, okay. Well, so who can write the backlog? Well, we got a BA doing it. If the backlog's authoritative, do they meet this criteria? Can the team estimate them? Can the team pull them into planning? Can the team know what's happening on the backside of it? Right? If the answer to those questions is no, right, almost every single thing that the team does from a sprint planning perspective is going to begin to break down. Think about sprint planning. The idea that I'm going to get into a 2 to 4 hour meeting, maybe 8 at the extreme, for a month sprint or something, and you're going to get clarity on what it is that you're going to build over the next couple weeks, right? We're going to be able to break it down, we're going to be able to estimate it, we're going to be able to commit to it, we're going to be able to sign up, we're going to be able to do all that stuff, right? If you don't have backlog, right, that meets this criteria, what tends to happen is that people come out of sprint planning without a clear idea of what can be built. And then the sprint plan, right, becomes just a best guess, right? If it's just the best guess, if we can't get to a definition of done, we don't have that stable velocity that I talked about. We don't have predictability. We get to the end of the sprint and the demo doesn't go well. We retrospect, we find out there's impediments that we can't resolve, right? I mean, it all starts to unwind in the absence of a clear backlog. And then the last non-negotiable is the ability to get to a working tested increment at the end of a sprint. And the idea there is that if I can get to a definition of done, and what do we typically mean by done, right? It's working, it's tested, doesn't have any new technical debt, doesn't have any known defects. We would love it to be integrated into the build. We'd love it, if possible, to have it in production in front of a customer. You know, you can negotiate what the definition of done looks like. But the reason why the definition of done is so important is because what we don't want to have is a bunch of indeterminate work piling up coming out of the sprint. Anybody ever heard that project management joke, I'm 90% done, I got 90% left to do? Well, the reason why is because we've satisfied kind of the letter of the law of the activity in the Gantt chart, but there's just this work that's happening that doesn't get done in the background that's kind of accumulating. It's not transparent, it's not visible. And so what Agile's trying to come across and do is it says, look, we've got this user story, the team has everything and everyone necessary, it meets the acceptance criteria, it meets our technical standards, it meets everything that it needs to meet, and we don't have to go back and do anything to it, right? Now here's the payoff for listening to me ramble down that path for a little bit, right? So if I know the size of my backlog and I know the velocity of my team, I can begin to derive how much scope I can get done if my time is fixed, or I can anticipate how much time I need to get that scope delivered, right? So I go to people and I say, we're not predictable, right? They'll tell me they're not predictable, or they can't get this done, or they can't get that done. I go, do you know the size of your backlog? No. Or they'll say even better, and this one drives me nuts. I do, it's full of 3 extra larges, 7 larges, a couple mediums, some smalls, right, all that kind of stuff. T-shirt sizing to me, unless you turn it into America on the backside, drives me nuts, because to me the whole point of sizing isn't to do a rough guess, right? It's to start to measure velocity. Right, so I want a numeric on that stuff, right? I want to be able to measure it, right? So I know price story points are passé, and Fibonacci series are probably old news, but I think they're still valuable, personally, right? Because if I know the size of my backlog and I know the velocity of the team, I can start to estimate scope or duration. If you don't know the size of your backlog, you don't have one, or the team doesn't have stable velocity, or you're not getting to a definition done at the end of the sprint, I would suggest that you have no idea where you're at. Is that fair? Right? And so here's the interesting thing, right? If you're doing a lean startup, or you're doing some experiments in your garage, or you're kicking off a company, or you're doing something that's incredibly R&D-like and experimental for a company, that might be perfectly fine. But if you're trying to deliver tax software by April 16th, or maybe January 1st or whatever, you might kind of want to know what trade-offs need to be made along the way in order to get done. If you've got 46 teams that all have to come together at a specific time to do an integration and release, you might want to know what features are going to be in that build so we can figure out what we need to integrate, right? And so to me, the root of that is teams, backlogs, working tested software. So a couple of other lenses through it that I think are particularly valuable is the idea of clarity, accountability, and measurable progress. We're looking to make sure that the teams have a very good understanding of what it is they're being asked to build. One of the big challenges that I think we have is that teams don't have clarity in their backlog. And I think one of the biggest costs to teams, even if they're well formed, is that the teams thrash around trying to figure out what the product owner means. Okay? If I don't have clarity in the backlog, if I can't come out of a sprint planning meeting with clarity, the team is going to thrash. They're going to spend unestimated time in the sprint trying to figure out what the product owner asked of them. And then once they learn it, that sprint commitment might be valid, it might not be. Right? So getting clarity in the backlog is super important. Accountability. This is a really, really subtle one. And maybe it doesn't seem subtle, but it's really subtle. So we talk about ownership of the team. How can a team hold themselves accountable for delivering something if they don't have clarity as what they're trying to build? They don't have everyone and everybody necessary to deliver it. They're having to go out and beg, borrow, and steal across the organization to try to get anything done. Right? They're going to start to lose their ability to commit. They're going to start to care and have ownership in getting through the backlog. Okay? Let alone you being able to hold them accountable to what they say they're going to do. They'll stop holding themselves accountable. So when a team doesn't have everyone and everything necessary to deliver the backlog, it starts to erode that team's confidence. It starts to erode their ability to commit. And so you want to have a culture of commitment. You want to have a culture of ownership, a culture of being fast and adaptive and responding to change. Give them a team that has everything and everyone necessary to be able to deliver the increment. Right? That's the relationship. If I've got the team and I've got the practices and I can actually hold myself accountable and I can care, right, then I'm in a position to be successful. Otherwise, I'm not in a position to be successful. And so all of that cultural mumbo jumbo about this is how you need to think and act and behave and own and respond to change, it all breaks down when the ecosystem is broken. Right? The idea of measurable progress. I think it's super important for organizations to be able to look at a team and to be able to say, this is how far the team has been able to make it. One of the things I used to coach project managers 15 years ago, early days of Agile where we were kind of figuring this stuff out. And one of the things that I thought was really cool is that in an Agile team, everything's super transparent. We know the size of the backlog, we know the velocity of the team, we know what done looks like, right? We can start to anticipate when things are going to be done. We don't have that 90% problem I talked about. Right? So the ability to get to really clear, measurable progress, it just makes that ecosystem work. Right? The third kind of lens through this that I think is interesting is something that was referenced this morning in Dan Pink's Drive book, the idea of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And the idea behind that book is as knowledge workers, only part of what we do is showing up and writing code or doing whatever it is we do for money. Right? Once we get our certain monetary needs met, right, it all becomes about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Right? We want to do something that's bigger than ourselves. And I think it was Howard Sublett, who was at Solutions IQ, Big Visible, probably back in the day. I was going through this and he was sitting in the room and he goes, it's very similar to Dan Pink's stuff. And so he kind of gave me the idea. And I was thinking about it, right? So if you think about the backlog, that gives us alignment to purpose. Right? Having a complete cross-functional team gives us autonomy. Right? The ability to get to a definition of done at the end of the sprint gives us the ability to demonstrate mastery. And if you buy Dan Pink's point in this, that in order for us to have meaning in our work, right, to show up and really care, we have to have autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Right? That's the basic ingredients. And I just thought it was kind of a cool observation that what we're trying to do in Scrum is trying to satisfy that fundamental need for autonomy, mastery, purpose, and knowledge work. I just thought it was interesting. Any thoughts? Questions? No? You guys tracking so far? Okay, cool. So the last bit And I'm going to go here just because we have so much time. I don't know if we're going to get into some of the scaling patterns and things like that at the end. But when you take teams, backlogs, and working tested software, autonomy, mastery, purpose, clarity, accountability, measurable progress, and you start to scale it up, right? What are the non-negotiables of scale? Right? And for me, it's, I thought we had gone first, structure, governance, and metrics. Right? So what we want to do is we want to look for opportunities to create teams across the enterprise. Right? When we create coordinating bodies, we want them to operate like teams. When we create governance units, we want them to operate like teams. Right? And they all kind of satisfy the same fundamental kinds of constraints, right? And so the idea behind governance is we need some mechanism in place that's going to enable us to make trade-offs when we have constrained resources. Okay? Balancing capacity and demand, that is the role of governance. I hope all you guys are leaving because it's so hot in here and not because my talk sucks. Just kidding with you. So it is really hot in here. I've never had a room this hot. So anyway, governance is about the ability to coordinate resources. It's about the ability to make trade-offs between capacity and demand. It's about the ability to prioritize. We were working with a group a couple weeks ago, and they're like, yeah, our governance mechanism, when we walk in and we say that we're over capacity and we need to prioritize, they just put more stuff onto the list. And I go, fascinating, right? How's that working for you, right? Probably not. You've got to have a governance model that kind of rationalizes this. We have to have a structure of teams across the organization, and then working tested software starts to look like metrics and controls and things like that, right? How do we know we're making progress? Right, so the basic fundamentals of transformation, right? The basic structures of transformation are not training and getting the right roles in place and doing all those things, right? It's creating this rational system of delivery that's going to, that we're going to have to validate to start to prove our hypotheses that we can make the system more predictable. Okay, so I'm going to pivot one more time. You guys with me so far? Okay, teams, backlogs, working tested software, structure, governance, and metrics. We're going to build the argument one more level up. The thing that I want to make the case for in this next slide sequence is that depending upon the needs of your organization and the needs of your market, you're going to have to implement Agile differently. Like, we are really guilty of walking in and believing that we know best and trying to impose a methodology that we think is good for our organization and not really listening to what the concerns of the organization are. Think about it, right? If you're super interested in responding to change and innovation, would half the people in the room raise their hand for predictability? Right? Those are different concerns, okay? And so what I want to do is I want to introduce a pattern language that's going to help you have this conversation internally. We're going to try to neutralize methodology wars, right? We're going to try to put everything in context. And so the first thing that we want to recognize in any organization is that the DNA of an organization is usually wired for predictability or adaptability, making and meeting commitments or responding to change. And I'm not saying that organizations are good at making and meeting commitments, but if you have a PMO, annual planning cycles, you're doing business cases, you're doing Gantt charts, right? You're putting together forecasts and plans and all that kind of stuff, you're probably built for predictability, or at least you're striving for it. Fair? Okay. On the way other extreme, right? Startups and different web properties and whatever, right? They can be very wired to respond to change, right? Because it doesn't really matter what you actually commit to market as long as you're putting valuable stuff into market. Okay? And so when I was writing about this has been a couple years now, I was writing about how these some organizations are built for predictability, some organizations are built for adaptability. And one of the questions I like to ask execs is I say, would you rather have your team make and meet commitments, or would you rather have them be able to respond to change? What do you think they usually say? Both, right? Both is the right answer. Okay, so what we want to recognize is that that's probably fair, right? You understand the business reality that they're dealing with. But the challenge becomes is that if you strive to be predictable, you're going to reduce the ability to respond to change. If you increase your ability to respond to change, it's going to be harder to make and meet existing commitments. Right, so the first thing we want to do is we want to get our executives to understand that those two things are competing concerns, right? They create tension in the organization. On the vertical axis, if anybody heard Aaron Raj's talk, today? The guy from Ford that's leading the Ford transformation? Anybody in that talk? Yeah, okay, cool. So we're working with Ford, and they've adopted some of this model. He put some different words up here. But, okay, so you can't see the lower word. That's interesting. So emergence is up at the top, right? That is things that are unknown. Convergence is the word that I chose for the bottom of it. And the reason why I picked those two words is because what the vertical axis represents is your market. Horizontal axis is your company. Vertical axis is your market. If your market is demands change. And I think about things like Facebook or Google, or sometimes if I'm at college campuses doing talks like this, I'll talk about Snapchat, right? Where you don't really know what your market wants, and you're iterating to try to figure it out. Fair? Okay? The other side of it is that I know exactly what I want, but I'm not sure exactly how to get to it. Okay, so on the top, we're iterating to try to figure out how to respond to emerging information. On the other side, we're basically trying to figure out how to iterate to take risk out of the system, right? To make sure that we're converging on the right possible outcomes. Okay, so we do predictive adaptive, we do emergent and convergent. And what that starts to imply is that you have these different combinations. And the first two combinations that I identified were predictive convergent and adaptive emergent. And the reason, what I was trying to do when I was writing about this at the time is I was trying to compare and contrast traditional organizations with agile organizations. Because at the time when I first started using these words, it was almost 10 years ago now, I was at version 1, and you'd get people on the phone that had purchased version 1, and you're talking about, oh, this is great, you can respond to change, you can take out requirements, you can put requirements in, based on our learnings, we can get feedback, we can inspect, we can adapt, and they're like, Mike, I know exactly what I want to build. I know exactly everything that needs to be in it. I just need the teams to get the work done. Right, anybody ever had that conversation? Right, yeah. So that was convergent, right? And so we want to be really clear on what our customers are expecting from us. And so we have this idea of predictive convergent, we have this idea of adaptive emergent. Predictive convergent organizations were really focused on making meeting commitments, understanding time, cost, and scope, getting work done. Adaptive emergent organizations were more open and respond to change. One Sunday morning, I got up, took a shower, I think I was getting ready to go to church or something, and all of a sudden had this epiphany, and I went up into my office and I wrote the quadrants on the board, and I started to try to figure out if the other two quadrants existed. And it was kind of fascinating, right? And I was like, has anybody ever had the opportunity to work into an organization that was absolutely PMO, plan-driven, Gantt charts, roadmaps, but stuff was changing all the time? Right? Yeah. And so what was the eye-opening thing there is that's where like everybody is. Right? And so one of the first talks I ever did that was based upon this, I was talking about why Agile fails. Right? And so the reason why Agile is failing in a lot of large organizations is because they're stuck in that upper left quadrant with heavy PMO, heavy governance, having to deal with constant responding to change. And so what they do is they do a pilot in the upper right quadrant. They get a team of 8 people, they give it everything they need, it's greenfield, they don't make it operate within governance, has no dependencies, right, whatever. And so they give it everything it needs, and then they have it do Scrum or Lean Startup or something. And you know what, it works, right? So what we assume is that it was the methodology that enabled it to work. So we take that methodology and we lift it into our existing organization. But we haven't broken dependencies, we haven't created teams, we don't have adaptive governance, we don't have product owners, we can't get clarity in the backlog, we can't get to a working tested increment of software, right? All those 3 things, and the methodology fails us. Okay, so my hypothesis 3 or 4 years ago, and where we've kind of taken our company to respond to this, is the idea that methodology applied in an inappropriate context is not going to work. Right? So if you want to use the methodology, you want the benefits from the methodology, you got to build the context. Okay? So that was the why Agile fails talk, right? And why that worked, right? And so the harder thing was coming to what the lower right quadrant meant. Because I had like kind of a really interesting mental tug of war. It's like, how do you create an organization that is responsive to change, but also makes and meets commitments against fixed time, cost, and scope? It took me a little while, but the answer is batch size. right? If you have smaller batches, what you can do is you make and meet commitments in smaller planning horizons, right? So most Agile teams tend to think in terms of like a week or two, maybe a month at the outside. If it's something at scale, you're probably thinking of like a 2 to 3 month release or a 6 to 12 week program increment or something like that. And so the idea is that we don't necessarily get any better using Agile or get better at making commitments using Agile, but we get better at creating breakpoints where we can pivot when we learn new things. And so that was kind of the eye-opening thing. And so the lower right quadrant is where I kind of ended up putting Agile. And so the upper left is kind of ad hoc, chaotic, lots of heroic behavior up there. If I'm feeling particularly snarky, I'll put irrational in that quadrant because it's just really difficult to get anything done. Lots of death marches and things like that. The lower left quadrant is the home of kind of like where traditional SDLC lives, but we're going to make a case that you can do Agile in that quadrant too. Lower right quadrant is where most of the Agile methodologies that we talk about at conferences like this live. XP, Scrum, SAFe, Lean Startup, right, that kind of a thing. And then upper right is, Lean Startup's in the upper right. Lean Startup, maybe Crystal Clear, right? It's really, no estimate, so I may put up in that quadrant, even though I wouldn't consider that a methodology, but you know what I mean. So the idea is that lower left is the world of striving for predictability. Lower right is the world of reducing batch size and managing to smaller constraints. And then the upper right is the world of experimentation. If you're a bank and you want to build a mobile app, right, you could probably do a ton of upper right quadrant stuff. If you have to interface with your legacy backend to build a new payments transaction API, right, that group is probably in the lower left quadrant. Right, so now you got to think about how do those two quadrants work together. Right, it's kind of fascinating. What you can't do is take an organization that's squarely ensconced in the lower left quadrant and put a methodology on it that's designed for an upper right quadrant kind of ecosystem. You guys with me? Okay, cool. So transformation's a journey, right? This was another kind of interesting realization. What I kind of figured out, see how this slide's going to build, right? When we're in the upper left quadrant, right, we tend to be kind of in a low trust situation. And when I first started kind of conceiving this, and I'll make a little sense as I build it out, is when I first started conceiving it, I had put a really hard line between upper left and upper right. Like you absolutely can't go from this low trust, highly governed, all this high dependency, lots of complexity kind of environment. You can't hop the line to the upper right. I've since kind of modified my belief on that. If you need to go from the upper left to the upper right, typically what you have to do is you have to create something like an innovation lab or a hub, like Ford did with Ford Labs, right? You have to create something to the side that can move fast. You have to create the conditions for it to be successful out of the gate. But what you can't do is you can't take that legacy mainframe built on COBOL, poor architecture, takes 3 months of regression to put anything in, and immediately start doing lean startup stuff. We've actually had some companies that really desperately needed to do that in market, and they would have made it like 10 times worse going down that path. So the kind of the initial hypothesis around this is that in order to get out of this low trust, irrational, heroic upper left quadrant, you've got to kind of go through the lower left quadrant. And then, like everything, right? Somebody gives you a hard time and says, do you really mean that you were going to start to do better waterfall first? And I went, no. Right, what we're going to do is we're going to use like team-based, iterative and incremental delivery. We're going to use lean concepts. We're going to probably plan and govern more than we would like, but we're going to stabilize the system in that lower left quadrant. And we're going to get it working, and we're going to compensate for the impediments. And then as we fix the impediments in the system, right, then we can start to think about doing Agile in the lower right quadrant. And then as we break dependencies even further and we can change some of our governance strategies and start to do team-based or capability-based or product-based funding, right, then we can start to think about moving into the lower right, and then up into the upper right. We can start changing like investment strategies and how we allocate work to teams and what things we expect from them. Okay? So this notional idea that, and if I kind of summarize it, right, we're getting our language better. If I want to be in the lower right, I might need to put some compensating controls in place to deal with the dependencies and the cross-cutting concerns and the things that are really difficult to manage, I can't be pure play Agile. I'm probably going to have to put some more structure and governance around it. Then as I improve the system, break dependencies, then I can start to think about moving to the lower right. That tends to be where SAFe kind of lives, right? But I would say SAFe's too heavy for a lot of organizations and not where you want to land. As you begin to break dependencies and change your governance model, right, you can take some of those teams into the upper right. Okay, so a lot of organizations, right, SAFe's really penetrated the market at this point, and so since we're not particularly in bed with SAFe, one of the things I'll talk about is SAFe Plus, SAFe, and SAFe Minus. And I mean, Dean Leffingwell would tell you that SAFe is designed to be customized, right? I mean, it's designed to, you're supposed to be able to pick and choose, and so sometimes we're going to put some things on top of it to help it work better in your particular context. Sometimes we're going to take some things out that aren't necessary anymore. Right, so there's a really interesting language that you can start to see. But the point of this is pointing out the idea that in the presence of dependencies, in the presence of an ecosystem that's not perfect, in the presence of teams that aren't formed very well or where backlogs aren't super clear, you got to stabilize the system in place first. Right, because there's no amount of lean startup or no amount of Scrum that's going to fix that problem for you. But the only way out of that is to actually fix the underlying ecosystems. Okay, so the theory of transformation. So this is kind of another just quick anchor slide. How are we doing on time, by the way? We started at 3, so we're about an hour in. Not too shabby. Okay, cool. So theory of transformation. Adopting Agile is about forming teams. Does anybody ever have this problem where their iPhone just starts randomly playing music? Yeah, I did a Facebook poll and it's like a thing, but like seriously, like phone's sitting in my pocket and it just automatically starts playing music. And it seems to like to do it in the middle of the night and when I'm giving talks, so go figure. Like seriously, last night, like all of a sudden it started playing Christmas carols at like 3 in the morning, so it was in a festive spirit, I guess, So adopting Agile is about forming teams, building backlogs, and getting regularly, producing regular increments of working tested software. At scale, it's about establishing a team-based organizational structure at all levels. It's about establishing governance. It's about creating metrics and tooling strategy that support agility. Anything that gets in the way of forming teams, building backlogs, and producing working tested software is an impediment to transformation. Okay? I would go so far as to say that the work of the transformation is not teaching people how to do Agile. The work of the transformation is creating a team-based organizational structure, an Agile, adaptive, lean-based governance model, getting the infrastructure within the system to where you can produce a working tested increment of product at every sprint. And again, if you train people and you hope that that's going to emerge, you might be let down. Right? Because one doesn't necessarily all the time lead to another. Okay? So where are we going? So here's a really interesting thing. Since we're in Detroit, since there's Ford people in the room, since Aaron mentioned that we were working with them, so I feel like I can talk about it a little bit where normally I wouldn't necessarily talk about a particular client. But the interesting thing in a lot of the large organizations that we're going into is that they're not single methodology kinds of environments. One of the challenges is that there's lots of different points of view around what is it going to take to work. Okay? And so this was like me kind of rambling off the top of my head, like all the different methodologies, right? So we have waterfall, RUP, DSDM. Anybody ever heard of that one? That's an oldie but a goodie, right? FDD, SAFe, Discipline Agile Delivery, LESS. Nexus. Anybody actually trying to use Nexus? Yeah, it's fascinating, right? It's kind of interesting that they're talking about it, but I'm not seeing it get traction out there. Scrum, XP, Kanban, Crystal. One of my favorites, actually. Anybody ever go back and read Alistair Coburn's old stuff? Right, some of his early methodology work? Doing yourself a disservice. You guys should go back and read that. Lean Startup. Okay? And so what I did is I wanted to try to get just a general idea of where these kinds of methodologies fit on the quadrants. Right? And I don't know that this is exact. Dave gave me some feedback. We moved some things around. I don't know if the positioning within the quadrant is particularly relevant. But if you're going to do Agile in the lower left quadrant, if you have any familiarity with DSDM or FTDD, they're heavier weight kinds of methodologies, right? A lot of what I understand to be like story decomposition, story maps, things like that, had a lot of its root in kind of feature decomposition stuff in FED. DSDM introduced a lot of iterative and incremental controls across multiple teams. RUP, we all kind of know and love. Waterfall, we all kind of know and love, right? As you move in the lower right, you have other methodological options, right? Nexus, SAFe, XP, Scrum, Discipline, Agile Delivery. As you go into the upper right, you have Crystal, you have LESS. One of the things that I think is fascinating is that like one of the kind of the underlying thinkings behind SAFe is that we're not going to teach you how to form teams or teach you how to break dependencies, but we're going to put a construct around it to help you manage them. One of the things that's fascinating about large-scale Scrum, and I'm going back to probably Bosvoed and Craig Lerman's first book, right? So I haven't really kept up with what they've been doing lately, but they really talk about the importance of creating autonomous teams, right, that operate independently, where everything's test harnessed and continuously integrated and all that kind of stuff. There's just one little caveat that says, yeah, this will probably take you a couple years to actually implement, but this is what it's supposed to look like when you're done, right? And so I think the LESS guys have it largely right, but the question is how do you get there? Right? How do you get to that kind of an ecosystem, right? And so the methodologies you choose are going to be largely, like I said, the goals of your organization and the constraints that you're operating under. Okay? Anybody doing any like Gartner stuff? Anybody use Gartner Mode 1, Mode 2 language in the organization? Yeah. So what Gartner did, and it has some traction with CIOs, you talk about dual speed organizations. And like at first pass, when you talk about a dual speed organization, you talk about the idea of like waterfall versus agile, slow versus fast. What Gartner's trying to get across in their thing is not really slow and fast, but more like systems of record versus systems of innovation, APIs versus App Store kind of a thing, okay? And so what you realize, right, when you start to think about this stuff, when you start to think about what Gartner's saying, is that your COBOL mainframe is probably always going to live in this quadrant because it requires more intentionality, more rigor, more control. Is anybody ever concerned, like if you went in your online banking and you were off by $1, would it bother you? Probably would bother me a little bit because if it's off by $1, it could be off by $100. You don't know, right? So we want our banking platform to be right to the penny, right? We might not care if our news feed in Facebook is exactly right, or if there's a button wrong on our mobile app or something like that. We don't care, right? Because we can innovate super fast at the point where we're kind of meeting the customer in the App Store. But there's stuff on the back that we want to be super solid. So I've made the case that the nature of your organization, your customer will dictate a quadrant. The strength of the dependencies between different things and different parts of the organization are going to dictate the quadrant. But I'm going to suggest that there's probably 50 to 80% of your organization that needs to be right there in the lower left quadrant and probably never go past it. Yeah?
Is this maybe a solution or an approach for an organization that has a lot of infrastructure, hardware deliverables, as well as software deliverables?
It just depends, right? What I would say, rather than to try to say yes to your question, is it's the amount of like coordination, right? So like things that for me would be in the lower left quadrant would probably be infrastructure, but there's probably ways, DevOps and different things like that, where you could speed that up. Hardware procurement cycles, things like that, a lot of times will force you into a more plan-driven kind of lower left quadrant. Right? The interesting thing always is marrying, I think I used this example earlier, is when you have something that's up in your app store that you want to go really super fast and it can change, but you inject a requirement that has to change your batch processing cycle right down in the mainframe. Right? So whenever you have the go fast mode interacting with the thing that's probably slower and more stable, right, you're going to create issues. So down here in the lower left, we don't want 18-month delivery cycles, right? That's too slow. But you might end up with, you know, a really solid 3-month release cycle, something like that, where you're going fast enough to iterate and change, but you're not going to go continuous integration, continuous deployment, right? Put things in market as fast as you possibly can in the upper right. There's a book that we've been reading internally by a guy named Charlie Feld that I think is super interesting. It's called The IT Blind Spot. And we encountered Charlie at another client, and he wrote this book to CEOs. And what he's really talking about is agility of your business strategy. right? And it's really subtle, and I can't go into it too deep here, but what he talks about a lot is when you're really talking about increasing agility within a large organization, you got to figure out what's central and that needs to be leveraged across the enterprise, and what can be pushed out to the market, right? Can be pushed out to the customers. And so what you find is that in a lot of the organizations, if you really take this idea of business architecture seriously, right, you figure out which components, which capabilities within your business architecture need to be central, stable, reliable, ready to be used, probably don't change quite as much, right? And you're going to implement methodology that's going to be respectful of the fact that that stuff is core, right? And it shouldn't probably change all that much, okay? Or if it's going to change, it's going to change in a very structured way. The things that are out to the market, right, that people are interacting with daily that need to respond to change are going to be things that you're going to look at using upper right methodologies for, okay?
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Any other questions, thoughts? So I still haven't talked about transformation yet, right? This is the hard thing about me when I want to write and speak. I almost need to write a book at this point, because it's like to lay the foundation, you have to deconstruct so much of people's existing worldviews, and then to start to lay a foundation for the next parts of the conversation, right? And that's kind of where we're going at this point, right? So now we're finally, I think, yes, exactly. We're going to start talking about what does a journey look like? What does it look like to orchestrate a transformation? And I had to go through all of this stuff with you guys because if I couldn't get kind of a line on the paradigm with you, like what I'm getting ready to do is not going to make a whole heck of a lot of sense, right? Most organizations, again, especially if they're in the upper left quadrant and they want to adopt Agile, right? So they're large, complex organizations, lots of dependencies, heavy PMO, heavy governance, but because for whatever reason, they're dealing with lots of change. And it could be change that's introduced by the market. It could be change that's introduced by lack of certainty on the product organization. It could be change that's introduced by poor strategy, poor business alignment, right? There's lots of reasons why we might experience change. The first step is not to go super hyper agile and hope for the best, right? The first step is to stabilize the system in place. Okay, so we're going to use a metaphor. I'm going to introduce a couple new words. I talk about expeditions and base camps. So in case I sneak those words in, I want to define them. An expedition is a group of teams that is moving through a journey together. A base camp is the set of milestones, mile markers along the way that we're going to use to measure progress. So to orchestrate a transformation, what you're going to do is you're going to figure out what pieces of the organization need to go together, and then you're going to start to put them on a journey of helping them understand what intermediate outcomes start to look like. The first step is almost always stabilize the system in place. Form teams, recognize dependencies, put in some lightweight governance to coordinate dependencies and cross-cutting concerns, subordinate to a portfolio, make sure that we're explicitly managing capacity against demand. You're probably doing that in the context of maybe a 12-month roadmap, 3 to 6 month rolling wave plan, and probably some pretty heavy 6 to 12 week backlog creation. Mike, that doesn't sound agile. Yeah, it's probably not agile yet. Okay, it's iterative, it's incremental, it's team-based, you can use Scrum, but you're wrapping it in controls so that you have coordination across entities. Because one of the biggest things that we've discovered from trying to implement things like scrums of scrums and whatever is that those tend to be late discovery mechanisms, and we don't realize that we have dependencies until we're already in the middle of it and everybody's overloaded, so you can't effectively inject your dependency into the next team. Okay, that happens more often than not, or those dependencies create disruption in the other teams. Okay, and stabilizes velocity. So what we want to do is we want to pull planning just far enough forward that we understand dependencies and cross-cutting concerns, and we want to extend planning far enough out where the teams can start to see and anticipate where they're going. Okay? And I'm saying this because Dave's in the room, and this is like an internal debate we have all the time within Leading Agile, is if you hit our website, I don't say anything about technical practices in this particular base camp. Okay? And the reason why is because I'm fundamentally a project manager. Okay, so when I was early in creating Leading Agile, what I recognized is that I didn't have the ability to teach people technical practices. So what I would do is I'd give them ground cover for things like testing and making sure that we could do a build frequently, but probably not continuously. I didn't have a strong point of view. But what we've learned as an organization, especially if you're going to go further down the path, and you're going to start to break dependencies, you're going to start to refactor, there's a whole lot of technical stuff that you're going to need to begin to start to stabilize the system and then to be able to lay the foundation for future base camps. Okay? So there's nothing in the base camp that is saying what work needs to be done. What it's saying is that we want the outcome to be get the organization predictable. I want it predictable in making and meeting commitments before I want it delivering early or responding to change. Why is that so important? Because the organization values predictability against fixed time, cost, and scope. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce Agile in a way that is not totally foreign to the objectives of the business. And it's absolutely respectful of the organizational constraints that are in place. We're not going to wish things were different than they really are. We're going to implement Agile given the current constraints because we can't remove those constraints often right out of the gate. Okay? So here's the thing. Once we've built trust with the organization and we've shown them that iterative and incremental team-based delivery can help them deliver projects more effectively than they could with waterfall, right? Now we build some credibility with the organization, okay? We earn the right to ask for permission to do the next set of things. The next set of things are typically break projects into smaller pieces, only approve projects that are 2 to 3 months big, start to lean out release management, right? As we've gotten the system to where it's predictable and we can act on it with intentionality, we want to lean it out. So Basecamp 2 for us tends to focus on reducing batch size and all of the different organizational things necessary to be able to deliver more frequently. So think about our goals: predictability, quality, early return on investment, cost, right? So what we're starting to do is we're starting predictable in the first one, getting things in market faster in the second one. And then once you've got that level of alignment, what you'll often find is that organizations that are out of alignment, and I apologize to any testers or project managers in the room, but there's probably too many of you guys. Right? There's a lot of project managers and a lot of testers in organizations that are compensating for out of alignment parts of the organization. Right? And so when you get to the point where you have things in alignment, you can redeploy those people into other areas or help them go do something else. And I don't mean any disrespect by that, but there's a lot of stuff going on in organizations that are put in place to compensate for out of alignment conditions. Okay? So it's in alignment, it's stable, you've reduced costs, you've made it predictable, you've started to get things into market faster because you've put in sufficient technical practices and testing practices, you've gotten better quality, right? So you can achieve a lot of those first four just by going to Basecamp 1 and Basecamp 2, okay? Now, Basecamp 3, you can either camp on it or you can pass through it. And so if you've achieved Basecamp 1 and Basecamp 2 and you haven't broken all the dependencies yet, a lot of times like SAFe is probably a pretty good implementation and control of that. So what you might have done is you might have deprecated some of the program and portfolio management planning that we put in Basecamp 1 and Basecamp 2. We're recognizing that some of those dependencies don't exist, but we've earned enough trust with the organization that we don't have to do all the road mapping and forward planning that we used to have to. Maybe we can go PI to PI at that point because we've built that credibility with the organization that we can do what we say we're going to do. We're going to create optionality for them in their portfolio. So we can camp on Basecamp 3 and do something like SAFe, but if we want to move through Basecamp 3 and start to go towards team-based or product-based or capability-based funding, right? Really difficult to do those things if there's dependencies between different parts of the organization. Okay, so the hypothesis is that if you can break the dependencies in Basecamp 3, create totally independent business capabilities, products, or like feature, or whatever, right? Then we can start to change the governance model and start funding different parts of the organization differently. And that's going to give each of the different parts of the organization a different level of autonomy than they had before. Think back to my mother-in-law example, right? I can make decisions independent without having to coordinate with a different party. That's the goal of Basecamp 4, okay? A lot of organizations don't need to go that far. A lot of them won't. They'll get to Basecamp 3 and they'll just be just fine. Won't try to move past it because it's too expensive. Okay, for parts that do need to. And if you start to think about it, right, there's a lot of different organizations out there that have some very advanced ideas around portfolio management. And they'll do things like they'll fund the platform. Okay, and so the platform has a life cycle, it has a roadmap, it has a set of business capabilities that they're trying to add, features that they're trying to add into business capabilities. And then the things that consume that platform are constrained by the roadmap of the core business capabilities that the organization has decided to invest in. One of the big challenges we have right now is that if a product gets a really cool idea and it injects a change into a platform component, and then like let's say 10 products do that, they all come into this one platform component, and then that platform component gets constrained. Right, and it becomes a bottleneck in the system. There's other ways of dealing with that, but it's like that happens a lot. And so the idea is if you could let that platform component operate independently of the different product pieces, right, you can decouple along that. And the decoupling comes not necessarily from technical or organizational or process, it comes from funding strategy, right? Basecamp 4, right, that's the idea. Right? And then for locally funded capabilities that are totally encapsulated, totally autonomous, if you really wanted to, you could say, okay, you go to Basecamp 5 and start doing lean startup stuff. You start doing R&D. You start creating disruptive change within the organization. Hard to do disruptive change when you're connected to every single thing else. That's, to me, agile transformation, right? So you put in a system that mimics the future state. You put compensating controls around it to deal with the organization impediments that are in place, because you've got to produce product in a reliable way or else you undermine what we're trying to do with Agile. So you put in team-based delivery, you put in iterative and incremental, you do it in the context of a broader plan. But the plan's structured in terms of epics and features and user stories, right? So we're creating optionality to change all the time. Then, once you stabilize the system, then you start reducing batch. You start putting things into production faster. Then the next step, you either start to break dependencies or you camp out on your dependencies and just start to not do as much forward planning. Right? After you've broken dependencies, you start to do capability-based funding. Once you have independent teams, capability-based funding, then you can start to think about letting those teams go and reinvent themselves, reinvent their markets. If they're a standalone product, go do whatever they need to do to innovate. Questions? Yeah.
Back at the very beginning, when you're starting this journey,
Yeah.
what do you tell organizations that are struggling with defining products and platforms?
Products and platforms. So what do I tell them? The interesting thing is that I tell them a lot of what I've just told you. Right? But the techniques that you do tend to be business architecture focused techniques, right? So what you start to think about is, how do I organize my business around major areas of capability functionality, right? So you can do a business architecture analysis, a business capability model of the organization. You find a lot of companies actually have them. Right? We start talking about it and McKinsey or somebody or Deloitte's come in and done something for the organization. But a lot of times those capability maps are not operationalized, because what you want to do is you want to look at the technology architecture underneath them, and then you want to look at the teaming strategies. And if you can align the business capability model, the technology, and the teams, then you can start to have a conversation about what your future state organization should look like. Okay, and that can be very structured and very plan-driven and very intentional. Getting back to this story, you might do that as a precursor to base camp 1. But now that you've organized around business capabilities, your technology architecture, and you've restructured your teams, now you're going to have gaps and you're going to have dependencies between things. That will give you a language for figuring out what sets of dependencies need to be explicitly managed until you can start making the investments to start to decouple them. Okay? And so now you've got a roadmap, and you can say, these capabilities are more strategic, these capabilities are less, these capabilities are not strategic at all. We're going to invest in refactoring technology platforms in the highest value ones. We're going to put agile coaches on the highest value ones. And so, because now you're using a business-focused language, you can start tying the business capabilities to strategy, start using strategy to decide what to invest in, right, and start to measure performance. And so that's really kind of the payoff of this whole thing. 2 years ago at Agile 2016 conference, I had kind of packaged this up, right? Because I've been talking about the same things for a lot of years. And what we had talked about was, I called it the Executive's Guide to Leading Large-Scale Agile Transformation. And the main focus of that particular talk was, how do you economically justify transformation, and how do you hold yourselves accountable to the CFO so that you can demonstrate progress? And one of the big points of that talk, that's super weird, okay. One of the big points of that talk is that the unit of value in a transformation is not the number of people that have been trained or the number of people that are doing Scrum. The unit of value in the transformation is a better performing organization. Right? We talk about using Agile to implement Agile. Well, so we don't want to use Agile backlogs full of training and hiring and stuff like that. Those are vanity metrics, right? We've trained everybody, right? Everybody knows how to do this stuff. The backlog is a better performing organization. So if you almost think about it, right? The epic is a expedition, a group of teams that are going along the journey. You can almost envision them moving through a Kanban. Base Camp 1, Base Camp 2, Base Camp 3. As they progress through the various states, right, we should be able to measure this part of the organization became predictable. We spent $1 million, got it predictable. Spend $500,000, get it to where it's releasing early. Did that $1.5 million have the economic outcomes that we wanted? Right? And then now we're going to start investing in the technical architecture to start to break some dependencies. Did that decoupling allow us to put things in the market faster and start generating revenue early? Right? Those are the kinds of conversations that we want to be having. Right? So we're not getting into this situation where we're doing Agile because it's cool or it's the thing to do. We're doing Agile because there's a very specific economic outcome that we're driving towards. Right? And it could be, just trying to be competitive in market, right? That kind of a thing. And so that's really, to me, is like the big payoff in this particular conversation is how do I take the organization, break it into chunks, prioritize those chunks to strategy, make very targeted investments with very measurable intermediate outcomes. One of the things that we've started to do is, I think I'm going to be done with slides and we'll just talk for the next 10 or 15 minutes if you guys want to. One of the things that's really fascinating is that, especially as consultants, we're on the clock all the time, right? And so people don't want to pay for, hey, just give us this big bucket of money and, we'll just, the best thing will happen that we can possibly make happen. With you guys as internal coaches, right, going to the business and saying, well, we're just going to do all this stuff and we hope that it's going to work out, right? It's not responsible, right? So what we're starting to realize is that you need to have a transformation roadmap. You need to be able to take pieces of the organization and communicate when they're going to go, when they're on the plan. What do the base camps look like along the way? We've actually even taken it even further down into like what we call outcomes-based plans, where we say, within the first 2 weeks, here's the outcomes that we want to achieve. Within the second 2 weeks, here's the outcomes that we want to achieve. And it's kind of like, it's very counterintuitive to us as Agilists, because we tend to think that planning is waste. But remember, right, the manifesto says responding to change over following a plan, right? While the stuff on the right's important, we value the stuff on the left more. And so we absolutely want plans that are resilient to change. But if we can't have a baseline of how this transformation is supposed to go, And we can't measure against where we're supposed to be. I mean, we're getting into a situation in industry, especially in these large companies. We've walked into places where people have $30 million a year budgets to do transformation. That's CFO level accountability money, right? And we're starting to see a lot of transformations that are a couple of years in and they're not yielding business benefit. And those budgets are getting shut down. And that's a problem. I think for those of us that recognize the value of Agile and understand what it takes and what it looks like when it's done and we've had success with it, it's unacceptable to fail. Right? So what I'm suggesting is we've got to figure out how to be more intentional about what is the nature of the work of the transformation? What does it look like to measure progress? What does it look to define a definition of done? And it can't be this Wizard of Oz, fairy tale at the end of 3 or 4 to 5 years, right? We have to be able to measure as we go. Yeah.
During your talk, you talked about transforming your teams.
Yeah.
And that's a key enabler.
Yeah.
Can you give some examples of what they're transforming from and what they're transforming to?
Well, so the basic pattern in the context that I was going, I'm talking about building a team-based delivery organization. So most of the time, what people are in is either a malformed Agile team where they don't have everything and everything necessary to everything and everyone necessary. They might be a team that is organized around a project or something else that has a bunch of dependencies in between it. On the other extreme, they might be just people in functional silos that were brought together for the sake of the work, right? And they're matrixed across the rest of the organization. And so one of the big things that we try to do early in, candidly, in a pre-sales cycle with people is convince people that they have to form teams this way, or they at least have to have intent to form teams this way. You can recognize that it might take a while to do some of these things, but if the intent's not there, we don't have anything that we're moving towards. One time, in the 3 things, I had a company in Atlanta call me up and go, hey, we had this consultancy come out, and they've put together this whole playbook and everything, and we think it's great. They can't implement it. Do you want to help us implement it? And I said, sure, right? I don't care anything about what process you chose. The only thing I want us to agree on is that we're going to get the teams, backlogs, working tested software. Because if we agree on that, right, we agree on that fundamental pattern, you can make any methodology work, right? It doesn't matter, right? I don't know if that answers your question, but so like the structure aspect of it is you've got to get them formed. The process aspect of it is you've got to get them doing Scrum or SAFe. Right? The culture aspect of it is that once they're formed, once they know how to deliver iteratively and incrementally, then you have to get them to be open to responding to change, right? Opening to leveraging that platform so they can make trade-offs.
And then from a skills perspective,
Yeah.
they are self-sufficient to remove those dependencies.
What? Say the last part again?
From a skills perspective, that team is self-sufficient in order to remove dependencies.
So ideally, right? So day one, they might not be. Their reality might be that they're connected to everything. If they are connected to everything, we're not going to pretend that they're going to resolve those issues by themselves. What chances are we're probably going to do is put some sort of coordinating entity on top of it. You might think like dual track Scrum. I call them product owner teams. I think Ford wants to call them like integration teams, right? There's different words for it, but there's some function that rides on top of the team that kind of looks out ahead, decomposes the work, understands some of the architectural cross-cutting concerns, so that when a team gets a user story, that user story is very clear, right? They have everything necessary to be able to deliver it, and they can produce a validated increment at the end of the sprint. So early on, multiple teams with lots of dependencies, we would like them to operate that way, but we're putting a compensating control on top of them so that they can get to the team's backlogs, working tested software. We would like to be able to deprecate that control over time, and we do that by breaking dependencies and creating autonomy between teams. Question back there? Yeah.
So you mentioned the clarity in the backlog.
Yeah.
Is it up to the team to define what clarity in the backlog means? Or can you give us some guidelines as to like to what level of detail? Is it at a level
it's you have to dial it in, right? It's going to depend upon the quadrant. It's going to depend upon the nature of the business. It's going to be dependent upon the criticality of the outcome. Like if I have 6 6 team members, like I'll give you a for example, I've got 3 developers that work for Leading Agile. I meet with them about once every other week, and I give them thematic guidance on what I want them to build, and every couple of days I check in with them, right? I don't do any of the stuff that we teach people to do, because I don't need to. I don't need to, right? They're dedicated, they're using discretionary dollars, they're dollars that I've decided to spend, they're making good enough progress for me. I'm very happy with what we're building. They're super smart, they're totally in tune with what it is that I need to do. And so the level of backlog that we give them is just high level and thematic, okay? Because I am not striving for predictability and cost savings and early return on investment. Like all I want is I want go fast, break things, right? And that's good for me. Way on the other extreme, I've had situations where we have taken a controlling team and specified to the finest level of granularity exactly what the backlog looks like for that team. Because if the team's capable and it has a ton of experts with a lot of intrinsic knowledge of the system, that team will make great decisions about, could possibly make great decisions about what to build. If there's 6 teams of brand new offshore people that have no idea what's going on in the system, and you're expecting all 6 of them to line up into an integrated product every 6 weeks, probably not going to happen given the team's autonomy about what it is they want to build. So depending on the situation, I can go either way. Obviously, you want to skew towards lightweight, empowered teams, let the teams decide, but it requires a tremendous amount of investment and domain knowledge, I believe, to be able to give them that kind of autonomy. And if you've got it, do it, right? But if you don't, giving it to them is just going to result in a train wreck on the backside of it. My opinion, right?
Right, especially when we establish these kind of teams, so they all want autonomy, but the challenge is, are they skilled enough to kind of, have that autonomy and move fast, right?
Yeah.
So what is the kind of, as a manager, or what do you do, right? I mean, they expect autonomy and they don't want anybody to tell what to do, but
Yeah.
they don't have a skill. How do we react?
So, but just think about what you're saying. You've got a bunch of teams, don't have the skill, don't have the understanding, but want to show up and be paid and do whatever they want to do. And I want a pony, right? I mean, it's all cool, right? No, with all respect, right?
Understanding that
Yeah.
team to some extent.
So the idea is that one of the very first papers I wrote a Cutter Consortium paper with Dennis probably, 8 years ago now, something like that. And I used this model. I drew a circle with like lines going down and feedback going up, right? So constraints go down, feedback goes up. And so whenever you put a coordinating entity above a team, the ideal is you want that team to only make the decisions necessary to help this team go fast. You only want this team to make the decisions necessary that this team can't make autonomously. Right? Because if this team has to go negotiate and coordinate with 5 or 6 other teams to make any decision, nothing will get predictable on the backside. So because we're focused on predictability, quality, early return on investment, to the extent that I can have empowered developers that love to come to work, right? I want it, but not at the expense of building the product. Right? So what I want is the coordinating, compensating controls to make just the decisions necessary to make sure that these teams can go fast and have good backlog. And so it's not a great solid answer like this team does this and this team does this, right? It can vary depending upon the level of seniority and expertise within the team, the longevity of the team. With offshore teams that are all brand new, tons of churn, they're getting pretty tight user stories.
Yeah, in my view, autonomy is conditional, it's not given.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, this was in the early days, one of my chief operating officer at the time said something to me like, Mike, if you keep doing this, you're going to kill our culture. And I'm like, well, if we don't fix this problem, we're not going to have a company or a culture to kill, right? So it's like what you want to do is you want to focus on what does it take to run a healthy business, and then you want to push as much out and empower as much out as you can. Like we have a methodology in Leading Agile, right? And I have 6,000 pages of documentation that describe different things that we do. And there's certain things that are really core and really important we do consistently. And then there's things that my coaches have all the ability in the world to decide. If they show up and just do whatever the heck they want and they're not on model, they don't get to stay, right? They have to buy in and this has to be important to them. Right? But then once they get on the ground, right, how you teach user stories, I don't care. Right? What cadence the team's on, I don't care. Right? How you get to a definition done, I don't care. Right? But if we're not doing outcomes-based planning and getting to measurable goals and being able to tie back to economic outcomes, then we have a problem, right? So you got to figure out what's the minimum constraint you put on people to build a thing. Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't know who was first, I apologize. Okay, deferring to the guy with the cool beard.
Oh, thank you.
Mark,
So,
excellent.
as you move to a business capability,
Yeah.
my view from the consumer experience side is the consumer experience is built up of a multitude of capabilities.
Yeah.
How do you then start to orchestrate and drive a consistent experience across multitudes of teams that are built up, making their own decisions, making their own decisions?
Yeah. So I don't want to try to advance the slide. So if we really got deep into the how of doing this, there tends to be business capability focused teams, and then especially because what you basically just said is that's just an expression of dependency, right? What you're saying to me is that those teams can't develop autonomously and independently because they've got things on top of them that have to be coordinated. So when you're doing org design, understanding what the business capabilities are is part of the problem. Then we usually implement like a really explicit, call it a program layer in the middle, similar to like SAFE's program layer, but we implement it differently. Sometimes it's around lines of business. Sometimes it's around product suites. It can be aligned around a lot of things that are more directly business focused than capability focused. And what you'll find is that you put groups around those that are responsible for defining backlog and feeding backlog into different capability teams. What those specifically are, I've seen it around lines of business. I've seen it around regions. I've seen it around product areas, product suites. I mean, just lots of different things. But again, the base pattern is capabilities and coordinating entities. So figuring out what the coordinating entity needs to coordinate around and what it needs to integrate and roll up, it's a local decision. Sometimes different companies will have like lots of different patterns implemented depending upon what they're trying to do. Yes, sir.
Would be the integration team?
Yeah, so at Ford, it'd be like the integration team, absolutely, right? My default pattern for that is I call it product owner team, because you guys are doing something that's a little bit tighter, right? Because what Ford's trying to do is to push that decision, making it down as far in the structure as possible. Perfectly valid pattern, right? So it's feeding just enough requirements and it's doing just enough integration in real time, right, to keep that thing going. Totally fine. Like you work with Rick some, right? There's the if you talk to Rick, ask him about like product owner teams and how we've implemented that at like Fiserv and some other companies. And like sometimes we create a lot of separation, and then that middle tier does a ton of forward planning out, right? It just depends upon the needs of the organization. Cool thing about Ford is you guys are all in on this stuff, and so you're pushing as hard and as fast as you can to get it as close to ideal as early as possible. A lot of other organizations, you'll get a lot more resistance when you're trying to implement that kind of change, right? So, anybody else?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the
Oh, yeah.
question was around, as you get into the Basecamp 3s and 4s,
Yeah.
and you migrated from predictability to adaptability, how do you get organizations to change and lighten the governance structure, which is primarily business driver versus an IT-only driver?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? So I think I'm going to maybe restate what the fear might be, is I put this compensating control in place and it never goes away, right? It's fair. That's a perfectly valid fear, and it happens. So the challenge is, it's like anything when you're building a product, you're always asking yourself, how good does it need to be? Do I need to go build the next thing, or do I need to get better at the thing that I'm doing now? And we see a lot of organizations that put those compensating controls in place, and it's just too expensive to break the dependencies, and they just leave that compensating control in place because it's working so much better than it was before. Right? We're starting to see a little bit of that happen in some of the conversations at Ford right now. But again, right, what I'm trying to do is, it's like, we're not in a position to make these decisions for any companies that we go into. What we're trying to do is we're trying to say, let's talk about trade-offs. Right? So we know team-based, we know iterative and incremental, we like the collaboration associated with Scrum, we like the visibility and the transparency of all the different governance stuff. It's enabled us to stabilize the system, get things in market, and really drive a ton of transparency and collaboration across the org. And then you go, it's going to cost $8 million to refactor this particular platform. Do I want to? right? Or is it better to have that coordinating entity up there, right? If it's a Gartner Mode 1 API backend system of record, maybe leave it in place, right? So that's the struggle we have as a consultancy. We want to see everybody go to Basecamp 4 and 5, but sometimes it's good enough. And people go, okay, see you later. We're good. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer or not, but that's the truth. Yeah. Anybody else? I think I got time for one more. No? Going once? Going twice? Thank you guys for hanging out for an hour and 40 minutes with me. I appreciate it.